Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney star in Two for the Road, the classic love story of the 60s, when girls wore anything and everything and fell in love with young men in sports cars.
You love me?
No, dear!
Do you?
Yes!
And then there were Two for the Road, 8:30 Saturday on ABC. It's hit and run action in flood tide.
We got the car. What else do you need? The main man in France.
What is it?
Time has caught up with Ramsey's amateur drug investigations. His efforts begin to destroy his world.
I just keep having these nightmares.
I'm frightened.
I know them. They'll destroy you. Don't get involved. Walk away.
Has the drug ring broken Ramsey's spirit? Flood Tide, 8:30 Tuesday on ABC. Major Les Hiddens, our bush tucker man, goes to the coast and finds the catch of the day.
Just show you underneath. Oh, careful. There. There's the meat there. You can see it across the abdomen.
And for starters, oysters natural.
Very high in iodine. And if you've got a bit of a foot rot, a bit of tinea, I guess the trick would be to put a whole bunch of these in your boots and walk around.
I'll remember that, Les.
Top stuff.
Forget about the Chardonnay and get into this.
Delightful stuff.
Bush Tucker Man, 8 o'clock Thursday on ABC.
Tonight on Sunday Conference, is sport our Achilles heel? Soon to face an audience to debate this question, Alan Jones, graduate of Queensland and Oxford Universities, radio personality, advisor to former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, and later one of Australia's most successful rugby union coaches. Lifelong Victorian Football League fan Ross Fitzgerald is a novelist, historian, and senior lecturer with Griffith University in Brisbane. Both are strong advocates of sport. Kate Jennings and Nigel Trippet argue art and literature is suffering at the hands of sport. In the late 60s, Kate Jennings was active in politics and feminism at Sydney University. In 1979, Jennings worked as a freelance writer and editor in New York, specialising in travel writing and book reviews. She was also the editor of Mother I'm Rooted, a collection of poetry by Australian women. Nigel Trippet is one of Australia's theatrical overnight successes. He is best known for his introspective puppet show, Secrets, which was shown in 12 countries around the world from 1983 to 1987.
She'll shoot up into the wind here, and that's what she's doing. She's shooting up into the wind. She's going head to wind.
Just about every Australian can remember where they were when Alan Bond's yacht Australia 2 crossed the line to win the America's Cup. Certainly Prime Minister Bob Hawke won't forget.
Well, look, it's just one of the greatest moments in Australian sporting history.
The Prime Minister was not alone amongst the incredible excitement and euphoria that took the country. Suddenly, we saw a new era in nationalism and jingoism. We adopted a corporate flag as an emblem and tried to believe that we were a nation of yachties. However, a few years later, and the excitement was nowhere to be found at the defending race. Apparently, we didn't have a chance, and the sporting public were not interested. If we're to believe the image makers and sports promoters, all Australians, and not just our Prime Minister, are sport and fitness mad. But the fact is that despite our bronzed athletic image, most Australians actually work up their sweat from the sidelines. It seems we really are a nation of armchair athletes, with only about 30% of men and women actually doing anything like this to keep fit. At last week's Victorian football grand final, well over 100,000 people cheered and jeered from the sidelines, and a further 30 million people around the world watched it on television. However, football is not the only game Australians will go to great lengths to watch. There's the cricket, the tennis, golf, and where else in the world do whole cities close down for a horse race? In In the city of churches, 4 days each year are set aside for men to drive little cars around Adelaide's normally quiet streets. Last year, about 300,000 people attended the Grand Prix, and about 10% of them travelled from interstate and overseas to do it. The Olympics are responsible for keeping millions glued to their television sets, watching new heroes emerge into national figures and be part of the euphoria that surrounds winning, even if it is thousands of kilometres away. Our winners earn a place in national folklore. There's Sir Donald Bradman, often called a living legend, Dawn Fraser, elected to Parliament, Greg Norman, who, despite his hybrid accent, is the image of the real Aussie, complete with a Kubra. There's Pat Cash and Darren Cale, who actually comes from a South Australian football family. So why do winning athletes have so much appeal? Why are they and not intellectuals or artists seen as credible enough to shape the minds of the young? Why don't our achievements in the arts, business and even science receive the same accolades?
Let your body do its best.
And now to answer those questions, please make welcome Michael Schulberger, Alan Jones, Ross Fitzgerald, Kate Jennings and Nigel Trippet.
Hello and welcome to Sunday Conference. Do we go overboard in our acclaim for and recognition of our sports stars? Do we tend to ignore those who achieve great heights in other endeavours? Sport, is it our Achilles heel? Alan Jones.
Well, certainly not. I mean, I think it's predicated on a false assumption, you see. I mean, the notion that sports people get everything easy is a nonsense. The suggestion in the introduction, for example, that we idolise and worship these people and they're remembered forever. There's scarcely no one in the audience who'd remember Maureen Caird, Stephen Holland's pulling petrol in Brisbane, and many of the people who achieve success do it extremely against the odds. They certainly don't have Australia councils to give them large buckets of money every time they want something, or all sorts of grants to be available from government. And I think that the presumption that this debate can take place derives from the fact that it seems to me those in sport are quite prepared to acknowledge success wherever it might be, whether it's Joan Sutherland, Patrick White or Robert Helpman. I like to see people do well wherever they are. It seems that there are some people, though, who object to people doing well if it's sweaty and smelly. And many of those people really have never understood the values which underpin sport or the discipline required for its success, or actually the fact that Australians just happen to like that aspect of national life. They can identify with it, they've been part of it, they appreciate those people who are doing it, and they more readily understand that than splitting the atom or playing a Stradivarius.
But we do it, though.
Well, why not? I mean, if people want to do what they like, let them do it, but don't start assuming that because they like it, that there's some hidden agenda and hidden motive, and the hidden motive is a negative, that we actually dislike the world of the theatre and ballet and literature and music. We don't. I mean, sports people, I think, appreciate the success in those areas as much as their own. I do.
Kate Jennings?
Let me answer you in this way. Last week I went home to visit my father, and he lives in a little town called Colliambly. And it's a new town. It's only been there for about 20 years. It's in an irrigation area. And the first thing that went in was the football field. The second thing, the bowling club. The third thing, the swimming pool. The fourth thing, the golf course. And it's a wonderful, terrific little town. It's got 600 kids at the high school and 2 doctors, everything going for it, except one thing, it doesn't have a library. The library comes for about 2 hours every week on wheels. I think there's something really wrong there.
I'll let you respond in a moment. Ross Fitzgerald.
Well, I mean, I tend to agree with Alan that it's a false distinction between, it's sort of like the mind-body split, as though, well, that's a bit grand, but as though people who are interested in sport aren't interested in matters of the intellect. I mean, I'm one of those people that believe there's a lot wrong with aspects of Australian sport. I'm not at all, I mean, I find yachting and golf to be an enormously boring activity, but tribal sports like Australian rules football and other forms of football.
Well, Alan, I mean, other forms of... Australian rules is the only Indigenous game. The code that it was an imported code.
But the fact that Australia has done so well in all the 5 codes of football, there are many of us who find football as a metaphor for life. That the fundamental drives like sex and aggression and the search for meaning, especially in a time when religion is broken down, the nuclear family is broken down. It's not a joke to people that live in Fitzroy or Footscray or Collingwood. Tribal allegiance is a way of getting out of oneself, and it's a way, in the Depression, it was the thing that gave people's lives meaning, and I happen to be one of those people. My longest standing loyalty is to the Collingwood Football Club.
I knew you were going to get a mention somewhere tonight. Nigel Trippet.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about that, Ross, because when we talk about loss of oneself, you see, it's interesting that the primo football fan will paint his or her face and wear a tribal hat and cover themselves entirely in the club colours to lose themselves. You see, the point about the arts is to find yourself. It seems to me that that's an internal search, right, for moments of subtlety and beauty and that kind of thing, as opposed to I mean, my audience can come out and they're not going to vomit in the middle of Melbourne. They're not going to maraud the cities of Europe, for example. They can speak in words of more than 2 syllables. You two might be very articulate and clever men. We're all articulate enough here to justify almost anything. That's not the point, right?
But you see, that's the false distinction, to believe that those... I mean, this book about Australian rules football, all the best of poets and novelists and playwrights...
Have you been in Melbourne on grand final night after the match is over? Have you seen the vomit in the streets? Have you seen the hoons?
Hang on. The exception doesn't make the rule.
This is the audience. This is hundreds of thousands of people.
No, it isn't. I'm sorry, it isn't. For example, you talk about grace and beauty, and I think that Sutherland in Lucia de Lammermoor or Robert Helpman or even Florence Austral, but I mean, poor Florence Austral there, she was one of the great Australian singers, no one heard who she was. She suffered the same fate as Stephen Holland and Maureen Kerr.
Isn't that the point we're making, though?
No, it isn't the point we're making, because Stephen Holland, as with Duncan Armstrong, we've worshipped him for a day. Find out how he got there. He hasn't got a razoo. He's got the backside out of his pants, and he's done it without handouts. He's done it because Laurie Lawrence has subsidised him for 5 years. Now, I'm simply saying, when you talk about grace and beauty and elegance and artistry, no one's going to suggest that Florence Griffith Joyner today, or last week, didn't exemplify that, and no one's going to say we don't see that in gymnastics. You see, why don't we just embrace achievement and excellence wherever it is without divvying up how much recognition we get and how damaging it might be if you get more than I do? There's an element of envy in all of this, that somehow you say, well, you might be succeeding, but we're not getting the publicity you're getting, and therefore our success is somehow inferior. You're the ones that are saying that, I'm not.
What's Duncan Armstrong's nickname? Animal.
Who said that?
That's his nickname. That's what his coach
Can I bring
said.
you back to a point that Kate Jennings made? A country town that establishes all the sporting activities ahead of a library.
Well, that's easy to understand, though it's unworthy of the notion of the development of the full person. But fundamentally, unless Kate wants to tell the Australian public that they're all wrong, their kids will go to the pool and the football field and the gymnasium and outside and kick footballs, girls and boys, rightly or wrongly, before they read the books. In other words, perhaps the library ought to be in the home, 4 or 5 books and an encouragement from the community.
Right. Let Kate respond to that.
You know, what can I say?
Well, what are you suggesting? I don't know what you're suggesting.
I'm suggesting that we won't be a literate, civilised, grown-up nation unless we can read. Unless young people are encouraged to read. No, you see, you're making this dichotomy. I like sport. I like people who are achievers and who do well.
It'd be better if we weren't
I'm not
sweaty.
saying...
It'd be better if we weren't sweaty and smelly.
I think that, I just think that's like a silly sort of thing to say.
Well, I don't understand
what
do
you mean
want that
I don't
town
like,
to do.
I don't like sweaty,
What did you
smelly
want that
people.
town to do?
I want them to play sport. I also want them to have a library.
Well, no one would dispute that.
You see, part of
But
we are trying to analyse,
but
aren't
they
we,
don't have one.
what we stand for as Australians. And
Yes,
I think
but
the
there's a
example
little
here
town
is
there.
we worry about sporting activities ahead of...
Part of the problem is, you see, I don't know if this audience is like any audience in Australia, at least half of the audience
will read the back page first. How many of you read the back page first? Well, yes, I would have thought a lot more than have put up their hands. At least half have put up their hands.
Part of the problem is that fine writing, with the exception of The Age, and now with a very good sports editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, there's beginning to be an awareness that fine writing applies equally to sport as it does to all other forms of human activity.
Let's open this up to those of you believe that we do have too much emphasis on sport in this country. Is it a worry? Firstly, let's ask the question, do we have too much emphasis? Or as Alan Jones says, we don't. Charles Slade.
Just something I noticed recently, that in Melbourne a couple of weekends ago there were 2 football matches, which I think were the first semi-final and the preliminary final. And I made an exercise of counting the pages in the Sun newspaper on the Monday morning, and for 2 football matches, they succeeded in devoting 12 pages of coverage. And I recall, going back through an old issue, that the Hoddle Street Massacre warranted about 5. And personally, I'm involved in sport, but I find the sort of almost mindless involvement in sport in the media here. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. The media in Australia, and I think particularly in Melbourne, is not so much an independent media as a publicity arm of the VFL. And
but you,
the
as
other
a,
thing I
you
would
as
make,
a sports, as a sports
the other point,
broadcaster,
can I just finish? The other point I would make is that I think another great disappointment about Australia is that the level of sports journalism does not in any way reflect the level of interest in sport. In actual fact, there's a lot of sports reporting in Australia, a lot of sports regurgitating. And for a country that's had just such a long and glorious history of sport, there's very few sports journalists. There's very few people who go into issues in sport. And just to sum all that up, I think the great thing that appeals to Australians about sport is it's so uncerebral, anybody can grasp it. VFL is an extremely simple game. You kick the ball, you catch it. When your opponent's not looking at you, you flatten him. Anybody can grasp that.
Is there anyone else in the audience who does believe that perhaps another endeavour other than sport should get more recognition?
Yes.
Right. Susan Ryan.
Well, Aaron, I'd like to take issue with your suggestion that by the media being saturated with sport, we're just giving people what they want, and the people living out in Kate's father's new town are getting what they want. I don't think that's right, because when people get a choice, Australians get a choice, they often show that they want something quite different. I remember, and I'm sure you do, when the first exhibition of Chinese antiquities came to Australia in the late 70s. And I was very interested in what would happen to that exhibition. And I discovered, and I think the Australia Council might have helped me discover this, that more people, more Australians went to see the Chinese exhibition than watched all the football grand finals all over Australia.
Susan, that proves my point, I would have thought. You see that Australia are capable of enjoying and absorbing both. I thought you were going to say that about the Domain. I mean, when they have Opera in the Park in Sydney, there are 100,000 people to hear Sutherland. Now, there must be something wrong with the way the arts are presenting their story, because when it's free, people have subscribed to it, they've gone to it. I don't think people divide their personality between sport and the kind of thing you're talking about. They're capable of enjoying both.
Yeah, but we're talking about national identity, and we're talking about the media's preoccupations, and we had a very good analysis there of, what was it, 12 pages devoted to 2 football games. I've never seen 12 pages devoted to Joan Sutherland or the opera, or to even an Australian movie. I don't think even Crocodile Dundee 2 has had 12 pages in one edition. So it's a question of emphasis, and it's a question of letting those of us who aren't quite so crazy about sport and might have other interests have a bit of a go and help to define our national identity too.
But what Charles is talking about, I would have thought, and I agree with that, I mean, some of the tripe that's trotted out week in, week out, and the VFL Star being on the front page of the paper when the summit, I mean, I don't certainly take that seriously. I think that's a nonsense, and I don't know why it's done, and I'm not too sure that many people read that.
But it happens.
Yeah, it does happen.
It happens.
That's the means. But that's the means. We're talking tonight about the end. We're talking about tonight whether sport has this overweening influence on Australian society which it oughtn't to have. Now, I'm simply saying that I believe sport embodies to a lot of people the sort of standards and disciplines and the sense of courage and the involvement and the respect for authority and the fellowship that really were indigenous to the Australian society from its outset. I mean, we are geographically an outdoor community. That's where we've been brought up, and I think sport embodies that. So the end result is that I don't apologise for our commitment to sport. I would like to think that many of the values that are at work there were more translated into national life than they currently are. We need a bit more discipline. Right. We need a few more standards. We need a few senses of value. We need a wider respect for authority than we've currently got. You can't succeed in sport without them.
Nigel, if, taking Susan Ryan's point, so many people do go, and Alan Jones, so many people do go to the theatre, do you have an argument?
Well, look, the Melbourne Theatre Company, we know, sells more subscription tickets than the Carlton, Collingwood and I think it's Hawthorn football clubs combined. We know that there's an audience there. That's not the problem. What we're talking about is the definition of our identity. I've taken show after show after show overseas. I've worked with rock and roll bands, gone all around the world, and I'm sick to death of having to deal with the fact that they perceive us in terms of a group of beer-swilling spectator hoons. That's what they see. They don't see you, they don't hear you talk. but they see us in terms of not the people who play the sport, not the people who administer it, but the people who watch it.
But that's the same sort of argument as objecting to Barry Humphries' success, because he portrays a sort of gargoylish character that the English latch onto.
What is interesting about Barry Humphries is the deep well of anger. It's similar to the one that I'm trying to tackle, that has made him create his characters. I mean, they began to to wipe this society out, to change it, to make people laugh at it, for example. You know, there is anger there.
But Nigel, if your thesis is correct.
We'll take another one from the front. Yes.
Look, really, aren't we sort of setting up these fairly neat oppositions? Really, aren't we asking ourselves to make a choice between cultural forms? We're talking about elements of the physical culture as opposed to other forms of sort of culture. I think that the points that I'd be very much in sympathy with are really the ones that Alan Jones sort of opened with. I mean, the VFL Grand Final essentially is a great cultural festival. And I don't think really it's a question of art or sport. It's art and sport, surely. I'd be interested really in the people who are, I guess, if you like, on the art side, and I hate to sort of set up these sort of oppositions because I think they're entirely false, to comment.
What I think you're doing...
Could we just get your identity?
I'm sorry, my name is Peter Frost. I'm from the Department of Sport and Recreation, Victoria.
If you see it as a great cultural event, well, one, that's a tragedy. What you're doing is banging out chopsticks, right, on the national psyche, and I'm suggesting there's a symphony there that can come out.
Could we go back to this fellow's point about women in sports? I think there are some women
Well,
here...
someone else, Senator Rosemary Crowley might like to comment on that.
Yes, I'd particularly like to pick up on the point that I think you mentioned, Ross, about a tribal identity. That tribal identity is very exclusive of women, and I do believe that something like 51% of this country are women. They don't even get a Guernsey under the sporting heading. They don't have a sense of belonging to the tribe. They're not part of our cultural scene. It's all right to mention Joan Sutherland, or perhaps we could even go back and think of Yvonne Goolagong, and yes, they've flitted across the stage from time to time, but if it's a tribal metaphor you're talking about, women are largely not there. They're not acknowledged in netball, they're not acknowledged in their sporting achievements. Debbie Flintoff-King's probably blown that for about 5 minutes, but it won't last very long. Women are not part of the mainstream cultural identity in this society, whether that's a sporting metaphor or an artistic one.
When you say
Secondly,
women's
I'd like
netball,
to say...
isn't women's netball, but I mean, do we know any more about men's basketball?
Well, indeed we do, and you'd only have to look what's happened over the last few years since the next point that I want to make has to be taken into account. Means and ends in this, I think, get a bit confused, and we can't talk about this without we talk about media coverage and sponsorship. Where are the big bickies? And by and large, where the big bickies go, goes the television and goes the imprinting or putting that message onto our culture, our identity, our image that doesn't feature artists and artistry. We have all these people. We have people who are interested, who do think in this society. They write books, they attend museums. They don't hit the front or don't get television coverage. They're not part of how this country sees itself. And I think it's about time we challenge ourselves to
talk about
change.
money, Rosemary, fair dinkum. I mean, if the Australian Opera were able to function on perhaps lower cost framework than it currently does, for example, there might be as many people wanting to go indoors as go outdoors. Now, you say that...
Why should it?
Beg your pardon?
Why should it?
Well, I mean, it's a function of price. People simply can't afford. I mean, the arts have their hands out. I don't know that so often they do have their hands. They seem to believe that they've got a divine right to really be a government. Now, I don't really see that that ought to be essentially their right exclusive of everybody else.
You're not answering what she said at all.
Rosemary said there's no money for them. That's what Rosemary said, and that's not true.
That wasn't what she was saying at all. It's just saying that there is a whole segment of the sport population that isn't talked about at all. Sport in Australia about men in groups drinking beer.
Oh.
Whilst it's certainly true that women don't get anywhere near enough coverage in sport in general, in terms of tribal identification, women are tremendously involved in football. Ghazali said that the only thing he really feared was the monstrous regiment of Collingwood women. That the sort of... That's a joke, as Humphries would say.
But see, all Samuel Beckett was a member of the MCC. I mean, he wasn't saying that there was a superiority about Beckett that really would diminish him if he became a cricket fan. And I mean, how did Banjo Patterson... Why is it that Banjo Patterson and Henry Lawson... I'll tell you why, because they happen to write different poetry from A.D. Hope. I mean, when A.D. Hope talked about botched, constipated bards, He was merely expressing the fact that he had no way of relating to the average, ordinary Australian and what their interests were.
Well, you're saying we haven't reached the peak in other areas. Is that the point you're trying to make?
I'm simply saying that they aren't able to identify with what the average Australian is about. Sport does.
Because we don't want to identify them?
I didn't say we didn't want to. I'm not going to tell people what they should or shouldn't do.
Bob, answer.
Well, I'm just slightly different position. I mean, the debate has been about the media more than sport, and I think the real issue is that sport has probably done more to publicise Australia as a nation than any other thing that has occurred in our history. It's created an awareness to Australia. It's helped us in selling our products internationally. It's created an awareness that makes us a major tourist destination in the world, and our athletes have been the ambassadors of this country over many, many years. But beyond that, it brings out a characteristic that the Australians have, a very strong characteristic, and that's the competitive element. We're a very competitive race of people, and it reflects in many things we do, but sport, perhaps more than anything else, is the mechanism we use for expressing that, and it's a very healthy way of expressing it.
Is it healthy, or could that be seen to our detriment? That
I think it's
win-win all the way.
It's a way of
that we don't have time for a second place.
Jogger, it's a way of getting the frustration out of your body. And sitting in an office all day, you can get out and jog, and if you've got an objective to run in a fun run or the Budget Melbourne Marathon in a week's time, you can prepare for it and discipline yourself. And it is the discipline that is part of sport that is so significant, that makes it unique to almost anything else, the discipline that you've got to apply.
There's a gentleman at the back.
My name's Ross Cooper. I'm a teacher at Collingwood and also a film historian, and I'd just like the panel perhaps to consider the question of the relationship between sport and war, because in a film called Hero of the Dardanelles, made in 1915, there's a significant scene at the beginning where the hero exchanges his tennis racket for a .303, and there's been much written about the team approach to war in the First World War, and I think later on as well. And I think this brings out some of the negative, what I would see as some of the negative, even fascist, overtones of sport in Australia.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt, Ross, that football taps drives like aggression. My favourite football aggro story is about the Barcelona supporter who was so annoyed when his side was down 3-0, he came onto the field and literally shot the ball. That's so
Ian Turner.
So the psychodynamics of that are interesting. Part of the problem is because many people say, oh, well, football's aggressive. Of course it's aggressive. The problem is whether one feels that is a bad thing. I'm one of those people that think that aggression is part of the human condition, and it's much more preferable having it canalised and acted out symbolically. I know that's an argument that people will disagree with.
I think there's more there. I would like to make one other point, though, about Australian films, that there's so few based on sport.
Well, that's also true of painting. I mean, that apart from Cunahan's great high mark painting and a few paintings about cricket, there are very few of our artists who've tapped sport.
But if I could just take the first point that you make, I would agree with you that any person who supports sport and what it offers to society would have to be concerned about the ugly elements of it, and I don't resile from that at all. Just as, since you talked about film, I am deeply concerned about the ugly elements of film and the proliferation of violence and vulgarity that is propagated through film. So I don't think that sport, with its limitations, has that on its own, but you're quite right that there are people often in the dressing room hyping people up, whipping them into some sort of a frenzy, making the contest a personal contest, making it exclusively a physical contest, go out there and knock them over and kill them and kick them to death, that sort of stuff. Now that's a mistake, and those aren't the values that I'm about when I'm talking about sport, just as I think when you're talking about film, you're not talking about it being a medium whereby every second person holds a gun and shoots someone.
I'm actually delighted that we started to talk about the Olympic Games, because I've been sitting here thinking that football is life, football is sport, and sport is life. And in fact, there's nothing other than football. And for those of us who don't play football, are not interested in it, never have any desire to play football, but have played sport all our lives, it would be nice to extend the discussion. So it might be nice to get the panel to actually describe to us what they understand sport to be, because maybe it's a little bit more than football. If you did that, then I think you'd probably get much more of a compatibility between the two opposing sides than you have now. I find as a woman that this discussion is about sport is really quite irrelevant to me too. I open the back pages and have a look at them, and then I close them again, because all I see are cricketers and footballers and horses, and usually not in that order. No, we don't have many films about sports people, but when we do, they're usually about horses and then men and then about
women.
women.
We talked about women playing sport, but women are as interested in sport, presumably.
They may be as interested in sport, but not all women sit and watch sport. Women like to play sport too, and all of the sorts of things that you've been talking about tonight.
I think the lady's
and
correct. It's
the
not
qualities that we've been talking about have a much closer relationship to masculinity than they do to any concept of femaleness. Now, lots of women play sport and they're competitive. I'm not saying that, and they're quite aggressive too. But if you look at the history of sport in this country, there's a very, very close relationship between its predominance and male qualities and characteristics, and I could go on about that ad infinitum, but there's no need to do that. It's really clear. Women really haven't been recognised. I mean, I'm sure I could give you 100 names of sportswomen around here who've got world records, and people would look at me and say, I've never heard of her before. So maybe if we can broaden the discussion, remember that 52% of the population are also interested in sport and the arts, and we don't see that kind of dichotomy, most of us.
But if we
enjoy that. Well, maybe we'd have a
reaction. Well, if we take your initial point, with which I agree, that I think the great thing about the Olympic Games is it brings to us what I would call these exotic sports, the sorts of things that you wouldn't go down the street to every Saturday and aren't on the back page, and yet we develop a wider appreciation of them, which I think is excellent, and of course women have a infinitely higher profile at the Olympic Games.
Kate questions the word exotic.
Well, they're sports that a lot of people in their daily lives don't watch or talk about, but when it comes to the Olympic Games, they develop a tremendous interest in. Women's hockey is one, men and women's basketball, the gymnastics.
Part of lots of women's daily lives.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it's only exotic because, you know, it's not in the media. I mean, it's not as if people are doing it. It's part of people's daily life.
Kate, you seem to be this poor defenceless person who's dominated by the media. Do you take all your cues from the media?
Well, from time to time, of course, so-called exotic sports do get the back page and the front page, like in America's Cup. Yachts, I suppose, fall into...
Yes, if I could make one point. The one time in my life that I hated being an Australian was being in New York when we won the America's Cup, because every time you turned on the television, there were Australians behaving in the most disgusting fashion. And you can't dismiss that. I mean, that's how we're perceived by a lot of people overseas.
Symbolically, it was a very regrettable that a supporter of Pinochet should be somebody who was so central to Australian sport. I think that's fundamentally important.
Can I just say that I think what that gentleman said before about there being a conflict between the two, I like sport and I like the arts, and I'm very sorry that everybody that is here who is supporting the arts isn't more verbal, because we're allowing the sports people to occupy all the programme. The sport, just a minute.
Oh, just a minute, well, let's hear the lady out.
Sports, it seems to me, expresses the masculine qualities of a nation. Arts express the feminine. And there is a reluctance on behalf of a lot of the media.
Is that a fair comment? Well, perhaps Nigel should respond to that.
You don't think that's right? No. You don't think arts express the... if I use the word refined, you're all going to laugh. But if I say the more... well, I have to say, yes, the more refined qualities of people. The more humanist, the more compassionate. Sport expresses aggression, violence, competitiveness. The arts are an expression of thought, of feeling, and no, not competitive, but and connecting with that. And because of that, because sport attracts the male qualities, it also attracts business, sponsorship, and money. I have worked as a theatrical publicist, and it is certainly very hard, and we won't go over that, the media again, but it is certainly very hard to get the media interested in theatre.
What is theatre? There's no greater theatre than a Melbourne Cup.
Maybe you should go to one.
I've been offered. I've been offered to the theatre, and I could most probably cite the operas as readily as you can, with respect. So that's proving my point. We're not exclusive. You can like sport and like the theatre, but I'm simply saying that theatre, like sport, covers many areas.
But I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you, but I'm saying that because sport attracts males, it also attracts the money that males make.
The gentleman at the back wants to jump down your throat.
I'd like to agree.
Can you identify yourself?
My name's Robert Nelson. I'm from Chisholm Institute. I'm an art historian. I would just like to qualify that point, that I think that the arts also express the masculine aspect as much as the feminine. But I think that you're absolutely right about the essentially masculine nature of sport. You know, in ancient Greece, the women weren't allowed to participate. You know, they could only be the stewards of the horses. When we talk about sport being a metaphor for life, as though, you know, it occupies some kind of ethereal pertinence to, you know, a general aspect of living, it's actually very, very specific. It applies to certain aspects of virility. You know, if we could invent an institution which reflected the superiority of men over women, it would have to be sport, because that's the only one that's so physical.
Can I take the sport? Can I take the...
How more physical, sweaty, dirty, hard-working, and pushing yourself through a pain barrier can you get than bearing a child? I mean, I started my life as a phys ed teacher. I love sport, and I've taught kids sport, and I think it's great. And I don't agree that sport is only about masculinity.
Good
but
on
I do have a problem about the interrelationship of how sport is projecting certain images of what it is to be male or female. And I think the obsession with football on the media is related to some of those issues about how we see ourselves as Australians and how Australian men continue their mythology about being the bronzed Australian god, when most of them aren't.
Gentleman at the back there, yes. Could you identify yourself?
I'm business. We help businesses get up and going, and I thought the topic tonight was whether or not sport was the Achilles heel of Australia and the culture as we have it presented. And it seems to me it really is, because what it does is it crowds out the other elements of the Australian image. I mean, look, tonight, here is meant to be a sort of televised intellectual sporting event. It's been particularly drummed up by the ABC to provoke quite distinct opposition between different speakers and the audience and the panels, and to be, in other words, a sporting contest. We've got people espousing one idea and those came back with another idea, and the idea there's got to be some conflict. We are not trying to find out whether or not sport is part of our identity to excess or in balance or whatever. Now, Bob Ansett talks about the benefits that individuals get from sport, and I couldn't agree more. The idea is about balance and whether we are overbalanced as a nation. And I think we are. I think that sport has done a lot to help the economy, it's done a lot to help our image of ourselves, but then instead of keeping it in balance, we let it go too far, and it crowds out the abilities for our leading scientists to be recognised domestically, our leading businessmen to get more than derisory sort of recognition in the press, for our leading artists and others to get the same degree of recognition that sports people do. It's not about what Mr. Jones is saying, trying to defend sport per se. It's not about what the audience are doing, trying to defend the arts per se. It's about balance in Australia.
But why do you think it is that way?
Bravo. Well, I think partly because sport is a spectacle and it's easy to televise and write about, and it's got a start and an end, and it's all encompassing, and you've got a winner and a loser, and it's easy to comprehend.
But if I could just say, I'm not, you see, this is the difficulty. If we have to compete, with due respect, with people who can draw such extraordinary conclusions that I'm here to defend sport, I've never ever attempted to do that, and I've coached sport at the highest level. I'm defending values, and those values apply, I think I've said tonight, to excellence, whether it be expressed in cultural, artistic forms or sporting forms. I don't care where it is. And I think if those people who are interested in the pursuit of excellence in non-sporting areas find that they aren't getting the kind of response from the community or from sponsors or whatever, and want to prevail upon those in sporting areas to assist, then I'm sure those who are genuine about achievement and values and excellence in our society would willingly embrace them and assist where they can.
Yeah, but that's
now,
an
what
unfair
you're
argument.
suggesting, well, just a moment.
No, it's an
you're
unfair argument.
suggesting-
You've been
well, just a
talking all
moment.
night.
You've had a say, and you're saying that I'm here to defend sport. I am not here to do that. I'm here to defend certain values which sport offers young people and older people in our society, and I don't apologise for those.
Well,
but as I said for the gentleman up there, I'm not here to defend the vulgarity and brutality that sometimes identified with sport, and nor shall I.
No, but you don't have to. No one is arguing about the values, inherent values of sport. Or the Olympic Games, which is the pinnacle of the world sport. They've got to be a spectacle that everybody is interested in to some degree. They're not the key issues. The issue is whether sport is overbalanced in Australia, and is our Achilles heel, in fact, by crowding out other elements of the national economy.
But how do you answer the question? That is what we're trying to discuss.
But I argue that it does, because it not only does it give us a lift personally and give us a lift as a national identity, but then
we go overboard.
Instead of allowing, and this may be through the press or through whatever other thing, but instead of allowing it to raise the country up into other areas of activity, it just keeps us in the sporting field of endeavour.
Okay. Well, we'll take another one. Okay, go and
disappointment, Michael, to hear
Graham Samuel VFL.
Well, VFL, but also Playbox Theatre and Australian Opera, to remove any presumption of bias. But it is a disappointment to hear the representatives of the arts in your debating panel tonight, because they've displayed, if I can put it in 3 expressions, I think an intellectual elitism, a tunnel vision, and dare I say it, a paranoia, which is somewhat disappointing, somewhat surprising. So we hear expressions from Nigel. Nigel looks at the grand final last week and he sees it as a gathering of beer-swilling, vomiting individuals representing Australia. But it wasn't. It started at 7:30 in the morning with Bob Ansit's magnificent breakfast, where every major identity from federal parliament, from state parliament, from sport, from business, from the arts throughout the world were represented in a major breakfast where they sung throughout the world the sporting values of Australia, and they sung the other values of Australia, the values of competition, the values of excitement, the values of national pride. We had 100,000 people watching that game at the MCG in probably the best known sporting event that Australia has produced, the best known event Australia produces on an annual basis. We had 100 million people watching it throughout the world, watching Australia, watching Noel Watson drive out there, right out there on his horse and sing our Waltzing Matilda, and watching all those wonderful school children go out at half-time with a map of Australia, including Tasmania, portrayed out there and showing the great national pride of our bicentenary. But all you could see was a few beer-swilling people. Kate, all you could see was the wonderful national pride of the America's Cup that filled the heart of almost every Australian, with the exception of one, with the most wonderful excitement and pride in this country. All you could see was some champagne and some beer spilling over in New York. Well, I'm just staggered at your intellectual tunnel vision.
Okay.
I think sport, you know, I just think sport is a quick fix. I think we need something more nourishing.
But it's there.
And I think we're stuck in this, it's as if Australia is stuck in this sort of adolescent mode of swagger and bravado, and basically we're not very sure of ourselves. And I think we keep going to sports to find any kind of identity. We're not going to get there in the long run.
Well, no, you speak for yourself when you say you're not sure of yourself, and that's what worries me, is that certain representatives, and it is only certain representatives of the arts world, are not sure of themselves, and they're not sure of themselves either because they are women and they think there are not enough women represented, be it in sport or be it in arts or whatever it might be. You're concerned because you're feeling...
Australia as a country is not sure of itself, and I think that would be hard to argue
Australia's very
against.
sure of itself.
Well, it's cocky and it's full of swagger and bravado, but it's not sure of itself.
It's also full of Dame Joan Sutherland.
But Nigel Trippet?
She's very large, but I don't know if she feels
A lot of people are very proud of it.
Nigel Trippet, would you like to respond? Well, it's hard to know where to begin, really. I mean, you're sure of it, right? The world is right for you. That's great. I'm suggesting that there's a whole lot of us around here to whom sport, while it reflects a lot of those very positive things, isn't all there is, right? It's as simple as that. There is more, right? Now, give us a chance, give us a go, let us achieve, but let's not put all the concentration just on that, right? Let's have a balance. Let's have, well, I'd like a bit more, please. I'm sick to death of sport just at the moment. I mean, it's an endless thing, and it keeps you, I suspect, in control, because you're part of the pack, right? There is a boss up there. He says, oh, that's good. He lives vicariously off sport. Great. Yeah. And it's within us to join the pack. It's within us to join the group all the time, right? So that we feel secure and we don't have to think. I think it's a giant opiate. Instead of religion being the opiate of the people, I think sport is. You're managing to keep those people out there where you want them to be. That's fine. You happen to be on top of business. You happen to be making money and making a career of yourself and representing the arts. That's fine. But that's not enough. There are a whole lot of people out here who don't agree with you, to whom sport means nothing in their lives. I'm trying to reflect them. That's all I'm trying to do.
But
There's
Nigel,
more.
turn it off if you don't want to watch it. Kate talked about how she was bored with the Olympic Games. I'm sure Bond, Skates and the ABC would have been delighted for her to watch the other 3 channels in the past week.
Well,
I mean, it's there.
I'd like to take a comment. You've had your hand up all the past hour.
Maureen Addenbrook. I'm from the Ballarat College of Advanced Education. I'd like to perhaps take us a little different track. I think that sport is a very important part of our heritage as a country. We're a nation which is built up basically of refugees and exiles from really a lower class of other countries. And I think that the arena and the tribal sports and so on are a very important part of our heritage, and they're a very basic part of the nature of our country. But I think what we should be debating tonight is whether sport and the importance of sport in our nation is holding us back from developing in other ways? Is it holding us back from being able to actually get in touch with the reality of the country, with the earth and the age of the earth, with all the things that make Australia as it is, and become something apart from our roots?
I think if we look at other countries around the world, when we think of them, you think of America's Statue of Liberty and multiculturalism and democracy and freedom. In England, you think of literature and justice, and the Welsh, you think of song, and the Scots, you think of poetry and frugality, and the French, you think of cuisine and art, and Italy, you think of art. When people think of Australia, they think of athleticism. And to go on from that point, which Alan was sort of making earlier, we all know that sport breeds discipline and good moral strength and teamwork and everything, and that happens in every country in the world. Kids at every school in every country in the world learn sport for those very reasons. But to me, in Australia, it doesn't go on from there. We have here on this panel some very balanced and educated people who like sport and also like the arts. They're few and far between, and I think, to me, as somebody who's lived in Australia for just 8 years now, it's a wonderful country, and I think that's fantastic. But the going on from the schoolboy sort of sport doesn't stop. There's sort of extended childhood. And in Australia, and I think it's very true for women, if you want to be part of the social fabric, you have to be involved in sport. And I feel particularly sorry for Australian women, because if they want to be included in social gatherings, they have to become one of the boys, and they have to take up an interest in sport, be it real or imagined. And I think that's where we're going on. There isn't a balance. We continue on a path that other nations broaden out from when they finish their education.
Well, I would have thought there was a growing sophistication in Australia, Charles. I mean, we're very young. You mentioned all those countries. God, we're 200 years old. They're infinitely older. We started winning a bit of international acclaim in sport, and true, the cricket and the Bradmans were the first people, and then Nellie Melba. But then progressively, we never thought 10, 15 years ago we'd have a film industry that would win international acclaim, and it has. We never thought that we'd have international singers, whether they be pop or classical, that would win international acclaim. And I think there's a growing maturity and a growing establishment internationally of other arms to the national identity. And for outfit 200 years old, I don't think we've done too bad. And I don't believe that we're sort of overdeveloped on the sporting front. Others have been allowed to emerge and shine, and there'll be more in the future, I would have thought.
To the lady there, yes.
Tracy Norton, the arts officer with the Shire of Eltham. I think that we're all interested in people participating, but I'd like to broaden this debate. I think that that sports and the arts are, broadly speaking, the cultural front that Australia has, and I think there are a lot of gender imbalances in there and a lot of other imbalances. But the fundamental problem is that this country doesn't value either its sports people or its artists as the cultural treasures that they are, and that whole area is simply not well enough resourced or valued.
What does this country value?
Well, I mean, I think unfortunately it does value the Paul Hogans, it does value those ugly aspects, and I mean, I do think that that's a very difficult thing, but I'm trying to lift it out of that split and an argument between the sports and the arts, because I think we're all under-resourced and we're all being forced to turn in on each other.
Yes, another brief one.
Thanks. So I'd just like to take it perhaps to a basic level and to say that I have 4 children. They're all male children, but they are sports people. They love sport, and I think you're right, it gives them very good values. I think it's a very important part of life. But I'm a writer, my husband's a theatre director. I'd like my children to read, I'd like my children to listen to classical music, I'd like them to understand about artworks. And they have no support from their peers, they have no support in the schools. We're on our own here. And that, I think, is where we're losing the battle. To create a whole nation, not bits of a nation, a whole nation with whole individuals.
Which brings me back to the library in Colliambley, right?
I'll make a point here. Mike Drewer from the Grand Prix in Adelaide. The introduction to this program talked about the city of churches. Now, I think Adelaide was far better known before the Grand Prix for its Festival of Arts. And I think the two, the Grand Prix and the Festival of Arts, have been very compatible. I agree with Alan Jones. I don't know what the conflict's about. For instance, Kim Benaithan, who would be known very well to many of you in terms of his support of the arts, music, painting, etc., also fostered the Grand Prix. It seems, and I agree with the person over here, why the two sides should be turning in on each other, I don't quite understand, and I agree with Alan Jones. There should be no conflict.
It's interesting that all the people who can't find the conflict are on that side of the room, are involved in sport, and all the people who can find the conflict are over here. It could be that you're wrong. Have you thought about that?
I'm sorry, they're not agreeing with you.
On the other hand, it could be you're wrong as well.
You understand what I mean. But it could be that you're wrong.
But Nigel, it could be that you make presumptions that aren't correct. Many people over there nodded their heads. That might be what's wrong with your perception of Australia. You're presuming where you're not correct.
A gentleman at the back.
Tom McCullough. I'm the president of the Museums Association of Australia Victorian Branch. Spent 20 years in the visual arts and fine arts. I'm now director of the Australian Gallery of Sport. And I think the division that you're talking about is a particularly 20th century division in an age of specialization. It's got nothing to do with the media, it's got nothing to do with the arts, and nothing to do with sport. The full development of human beings was observed by the ancient Greeks. In the Renaissance period, the active and contemplative lives were balanced. And the tragedy is that we're hearing very divided and divisive comments tonight, mainly from people in the arts. But since becoming involved in sport, I've found many of my friends in the fine arts are cupboard sportsmen. They are coming forward and shamefacedly admitting that they loved sport, but they didn't like to admit it in the circle of elitism that unfortunately is bred in some sectors of the arts.
Because
so if
of
you
the
don't
image
like
that
sport,
has of
too
being
bad.
somehow anti-intellectual. And for example, that woman with the 4 children, who are sports people, but also you'd like to encourage them. If there was more writers of the calibre of, say, Martin Flanagan of The Age, if newspaper proprietors are willing to put in the sort of money so that the back pages in Australian newspapers are like the back pages in some of the fine newspapers in England and America. There's not very many, I admit. And there's no reason why artists and poets and painters can't utilise the culture of sport in a way that we can utilise all sorts of
But
other
if I could
forms.
just take the lady with the 4 children, because I think you're the statement of the evening, if I might just say, because I don't think there's anyone here or any sports person in this country who disagree with your concern. I certainly share that concern, and I think the way in which you presented it highlights that there isn't a division. You love the kids being good at sport. You hope somewhere an emerging and mature Australia will make them just as good at the other aspects of the total personality. I agree with you entirely.
Martin Flanagan, you've referred to, is also here. Yeah.
I just think that we've spoken a lot in generalisations tonight. The lady who said that made the masculine-feminine division, I don't think that explains Picasso's art. And you also implied that thought and feeling is in the arts, and therefore that thought and feeling isn't in sport. At the same time, I just see sport as a human activity, therefore it has meaning. And I think that the responsibility is to try and state that meaning correctly and not exaggerate it or amplify it. We must never forget that Hitler used the Berlin Olympics, the Argentinian junta used the World Cup in Argentina. And we must have a critical intelligence when we view it, and that comes from being balanced. And also, I'm proud of the fact that I reviewed Kate's poetry book, the Australian Women's Poetry Book.
Pegbook Bar.
I agree with Alan Jones and with Bob Ansett. I think that sport is an essential part of our Australian cultural heritage. I think sport is something that the average Australian is able to identify more easily with than with the arts. I think most Australians appreciate the arts, but not everyone has the capacity to understand it properly, and so they can understand sport better. I think it derives also from our very origins. When our first people came from overseas 200 years ago, most of them came from very disadvantaged areas. Sport in the countries they came from was exclusive to the wealthy and the privileged people. But when these people came out and were settled here, they found it was something that they could be equal. Provided they had the interest and the ability to do it, they could find in sport a friendship and something that developed a social intercourse for them that was lacking in their previous life. And I think since we are so isolated and we don't have the easy access as European countries do, this has grown more in the national identity. I think we can appreciate both, but I think sport is a very important part of our heritage.
Okay, that sort of really sums a lot up, but a couple more just to end it then. Susan Ryan.
Well, surely the question is, what is it that a kid learns about being an Australian when they start to look at the world around them, the Australian world around them? They learn that being an Australian is being interested in sport, being good at sport perhaps, but it's a lot of other things. And I'd like to take issue with Alan and a few other people who've said we've only been here for 200 years. Being an Australian is recognising that there's a culture here that's 40,000 years old. It's recognising that we're a multicultural society. It's recognising that we can make movies, we can write books, we can write poetry, we can act in plays, we have some very good musicians. It's recognising all of those things. And I would like to think as kids go into the school system and learn about Australia, they learn all of those things. And they have a terrific time at the footy or whatever on Saturdays, but they don't forget, or they're not excluded from the idea that we're a whole lot of things in Australia and we've got a history 40,000 years old.
Bill Palmer from the National Basketball League. It's been an interesting discussion, really, and I agree with some of the comments that have been made, that we've created an adversary situation here that is artificial in my mind. As a sportsman and one of the new emerging sports in this country, basketball, I find it hard to have a guilt trip laid on me because we've been successful and we've gone out and promoted ourselves, and we have, because of the nature of sport, we can't operate a national competition unless we get corporate support, because people will not pay to see sport through the gate the same amount of money that they will pay to see art. Therefore, you have to supplement that if you're going to present something the public wants to see. I think, you know, it's wrong to say that that sport inherently something wrong with sport. I think what's inherently wrong is in the education system, and I'd have to take up Susan Ryan's point, is you aren't going to artificially manufacture an equality between arts and sport. It has to be something that's intellectually understood, and the basis for that is really at the education level. Now, there's something wrong with the school system, and we compare maybe Australia to other systems. People aren't going through to the tertiary system. The tertiary system's small here. So, and very much you look at the school system as well, it's very, very unitary, and very early on you're picking an element of study, maybe as early as fourth form, and that's what you study after that. And you look at a lot of the more liberal arts education institutions around the world, they come up very broad-minded in what they're exposed to. They aren't just economic majors, they study history, they study the arts and other forms like that. And I think a lot of our problem is really one of education. Certainly the success that sport has had in new emerging sports has been a process of educating the population to appreciate that particular sport. I think the same problem is with the arts. It's the institution of education that needs to be improved and broaden everybody's minds.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's get a wind up here. Okay, let's start with you. Is a sporting image better than no image at all overseas? Because you're concerned, as you expressed, about the image that we have.
I don't think that's a question. I just think I wish that there was a balance, as this man was saying, and if there is going to be a balance, that at least women be represented in that part of the sports.
But you expressed particular concern about what our sporting image is doing to us overseas. That's why, because it was brought up a moment ago.
Well, yes, I know, but the fact that the cultural identity is sport, I mean, that's a fact, it's true. I wish it was otherwise.
But to the detriment of other things. No, yes. No, the point I'm trying to get to you now is we can have sport, and I think this is what the audience is trying to tell us, that we can have sport, but we can have other things as well.
Oh, it would be wonderful.
But you don't believe we have it?
No, not at all. I mean, occasionally movies, maybe, but no, sport dominates our image overseas.
Ross?
Well, I mean, I think the point that Martin Flanagan made about the responsibility of those that write about sport and our culture is very important. And that I don't think that there's a bifurcation at all. As I said, it's like the mind-body split. I mean, we're whole people. And I can't see any reason why one can't tap sport any more than one can tap other aspects of our culture.
Are we at the moment, though, too much sport-oriented to the detriment of anything else?
Well, it depends which sort of sports. You see, I'm one of those people that find the sort of Bond yachting scenario one that's not at all wholesome for Australia. I'm a person that believes that the sort of sports that connect with ordinary women and men's loyalties are much more important. And that's why I'm one of those people that the sort of sports that I identify with are those sports that I regard as tribal sports.
No, like Brian Dixon's point about the mind, the body and the soul, right? You've got the body, and I'm going to keep fighting for the mind and the soul and try and get some balance. And I'm not going to stop.
Alan Jones, from what you've heard tonight, any change of thinking?
Well, no, well, I mean, Nigel's not the Lone Ranger who's interested in the mind, the body and the soul. I mean, I'm unapologetically saying that where sport is done well, it represents fantastic values that I'd want all Australians to embrace. But that doesn't mean to say that the lady with the 4 children isn't articulating a problem that many Australians feel, and that Susan's point about the development of the whole personality through the education system isn't correct. I'd just like to end with one point, Susan. You were the Minister for Education for a long time, and I would have hoped that we would have been more actively pursuing those ends. So I don't have any difficulty with the values that sport's about, and I equally don't have any difficulty with recognising that the arts have an important role to play. If that role isn't adequately developed, we ought to work hard towards developing it.
Alan, I made this point that you're making right at the very beginning, and you sneered at me, and you tended to sort of bully right through the discussion. Why did you do that? Why didn't you talk with us? If you feel bullied, Kate,
that's a personal disposition towards me that you must harbour and engender. I haven't sought to do that. If you feel that through your argument, though, that you were limited in what you're trying to argue and defensive, that's your problem, it isn't mine.
On that friendly sporting note, thank you, panel members. Thank you, audience. And until next week for Sunday Conference, good night. Next week on Sunday Conference, something that affects all of us in one way or another, censorship. We question who has the right to pass judgment on what we read, watch and say, and who should have the responsibility for making that decision. The media, often hailed as irresponsible in its reporting, is able to bring home in graphic detail history-making events around the world. But there are those who believe the media is having a detrimental effect on our society and should be censored. Censorship, the stamp of approval, next Sunday night on ABC television.